Whenever Jesus spoke to somebody or had an encounter with a person, there was always a reason for it. Each and every thing that Jesus ever did was done with a purpose. In many cases, the purpose was to teach the people that saw what he did a lesson that they wouldn't soon forget. And it seemed he got his point across most of the time. Over the next few Sunday nights, we're going to engage ourselves in a study of the personal encounters of Jesus. Now, this sort of kind of goes along with our Sunday morning series on Look at the Man, sort of a supplement to it. But Sunday nights is going to be more about how Jesus interacted with people from all different walks of life, to help us understand how maybe we need to be interacting with people from all different walks of life. This evening, I want us to look at a specific healing that Jesus did, and how from just this one encounter of Jesus, we can learn at least 3 very specific lessons about how we should interact with, well, let's just say the less desirables of society. If you would open up your Bibles to John chapter 5. John chapter 5. This evening we're going to look at Jesus' encounter at the pool. He has returned to Jerusalem after doing a repeat performance, we might say, in Cana of Galilee. He had turned the water to wine for his first miracle, and then had healed the official's son. And now he's back in Jerusalem because, well, it's feast time. And in John 5, verses 1 through 15, we are told, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of individuals, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going down, another steps in before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take up your bed, and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, Take up your bed and walk.' Then they asked him, 'Who is this man who said to you, Take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him." From this one encounter Jesus had, we can learn at least 3 valuable lessons about how Jesus interacted, how Jesus treated the less desirables in society. Those people who were different than quote-unquote respectable people. The people who maybe wore different types of clothes, or spoke a different language, or had different physical traits. In this case, a man was an invalid. All he could do was lay by this pool. So the quote-unquote respectable people in society would say he is of no use. He's a less desirable. So how did Jesus treat him? Well, he treated them with love. There's a lesson on love, there's a lesson on legalism, and there's a lesson on life. Let's begin by looking at the lesson on love that is taught here. Now, the first thing we have to understand to learn about this lesson about love is location. People in Hollywood will tell you the most important thing about any TV show or movie is location. Location, location, location. Location is very important. in this story. First of all, the location of the pool is significant. You see, it was believed that at this pool in Jerusalem, that every so often an angel would come down to that pool and stir up the waters. And whoever was the first one to get into the pool after the waters were stirred, then they would be cured of whatever problem that they had. Now, verse 4 is not in all translations. It's not in all manuscripts. The King James does include it in the text. The American Standard has it in the text, but it's in parentheses. But let's see what verses 3 and 4... excuse me. Let's see what verses 3 and 4 would say if we read them together from this version. In these roofed colonnades, a multitude of individuals, blind, lame, and paralyzed, were laid, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. Now, that sounds sort of far-fetched. The water stirred, then the first person in was healed. That sounds sort of, crazy. But you know what? Apparently, it worked that way. You want to know why we know it worked that way? Because if it didn't, this man wouldn't be laying by the pool. He wouldn't be trying to get in the pool when the waters were stirred. Apparently, this was God's way of healing certain people in Jerusalem. So as far-fetched as it sounds, it must have really been happening this way. Now, for 38 years, this guy had been waiting. He had been trying to get into the water, but he was an invalid. Invalids don't move very fast. And so while he's trying to get into the water, someone would go down ahead of him. And so the location of the pool at Bethesda, the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, with the covered colonnades and everything, very significant. But I think also significant is the location of the Christ. In fact, I believe that the location of the Christ is even more significant. Because Jesus wasn't off in some ivory tower somewhere debating academics with the teachers. He wasn't over here in a group with the Pharisees and arguing with them and the Sadducees about things. He did that on occasion, put them in their place and so forth. But Jesus went where those who needed him were. Always. In fact, he will say it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And so he went where people needed him. It'd be sort of like us going and visiting a hospital or a nursing home. People who are sick, who needed Jesus, he went to them. And sometimes people who are sick, they need us to visit them. I remember when I was growing up, on Tuesday nights, the congregation I attended had what they called prime time, which was a time when those who wanted to would come to the church building. They'd eat a meal that had been prepared, and then they would go out to visit people that had visited the church, the congregation that Sunday or previously, or needed visits, things of that nature. And the youth were involved in that as well. And so we would oftentimes go and visit youth that had visited or that needed some encouragement. But sometimes we would go to a hospital there in San Antonio, and we would go up to the desk and we would ask for the room numbers and names of anyone in the hospital that identified as members of the Church of Christ. And that's very fun to do when you go into a Baptist hospital or a Catholic hospital. It's a great thing to do, but you can't do it anymore because of HIPAA laws and stuff like that. So anyway, but we would then go and visit. Didn't matter what congregation they went to, just if they were members of the Church of Christ, we would go and visit them in their room for a few minutes, and they loved it. And we loved it, and it did them good, and it did us good. Doing things for people when they need it feels good all the way around. Jesus went where people who needed him were. So the location of the Christ leads us to the lesson that we learn, the lesson about love. Notice Jesus asks the man, do you want to get well? Do you want to be healed? You want to talk about your all-time duh questions, right? I mean, seriously, this guy had been an invalid for 38 years. And Jesus asked him, do you want to get well? Seriously? I mean, isn't it obvious? But isn't it impossible? Not necessarily. But maybe the return of hope to this man was too much for him to bear. Note the man's reply in verse 7. Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm going, another steps down before me. He says, well, of course I want to get well, but it's impossible. I can't get to the water fast enough. Maybe he's thinking that Jesus has these 12 other people with him and everything, so they're going to hang with him for a little while. And when the water stirs, they're going to help him get into the pool first. I don't know. But he sees it as a difficult situation, as a nearly impossible situation for him to get well. Well, Jesus, I guess he thrives on impossible situations. Because after he asks, do you want to get well? Do you want to be healed? Jesus says, take up your bed and walk. I don't know about you, but if I try to picture this scene in my mind, I see the man looking up at Jesus with a questioning look to say, for 38 years I've been trying to stand up, and I can't do it. And I can almost picture Jesus in my mind's eye putting his hand down and saying to the man, try one more time. Just get up. And he helps the man up, and the man grabs his bed. And in so doing, Jesus taught that everyone deserves a chance. Jesus taught that you can't disqualify someone from our love just because of who they are, or because of what they look like, or because of what their physical condition is, or because of this, or because of that, or because of the other. We can't just disqualify people from our love indiscriminately. We need to understand that everybody is deserving of our love, no matter what color their skin is, no matter what their socioeconomic class is, no matter what their job is, no matter anything. They all are deserving of our love, even those who are, quote unquote, less desirables in our society and in our culture. Jesus taught a lesson on love by healing this man who had been an invalid for 38 years. But he also taught a lesson on legalism. If you look at the second part of verse 9, now that day was the Sabbath. The Sabbath. The Sabbath would become quite a point of contention between Jesus and the Jewish people. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, the fourth of the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. But Exodus 20 isn't the only place where the 10 Commandments are recorded. Did you know that? They're also recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And in verses 12 through 15, we have the fourth commandment. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, it sounds pretty cut and dry. Sabbath day, you don't work. No work on the Sabbath day. Not even slaves could work on the Sabbath day. Not even people who were visiting your community could work on the Sabbath. Can you imagine if you were a business person and didn't know anything about the Jewish culture or religion, and you were in Jerusalem and it was the Sabbath day, and you decide, I need to go get something from the store, and you go down to the store and you can't get anything. And you ask them, hey, why in the store selling today? I mean, it's, why not? Oh, it's a Sabbath day. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, you can't work on the Sabbath day, so therefore they can't sell anything on the Sabbath day. And how confusing that would be to a person who is just visiting. Their slaves couldn't work, they couldn't work, people visiting couldn't work. In fact, not even their animals could work on the Sabbath day. Can you imagine if you were a Jewish farmer and your family had one ox that helped you plow your fields and do your work and things like that, and one Sabbath day, that ox does something that is considered work by somebody else. And as a result of that, it was very clear what was to happen to any one or thing that desecrated the Sabbath by working. It had to be killed, totally destroyed. What that means is that you had to kill the one ox that your family has, and you couldn't even enjoy a barbecue afterwards. You couldn't eat the meat of the ox because it had desecrated the Sabbath. That's how serious they took these things. And that's how serious the Sabbath was observed by the Jewish nation. Well, let's talk about the Jews for a moment. The Jews sought to answer the age-old question, what is work? How far can you walk in a day and it not be considered work? How many steps can you take? How much weight can you lift and it not be considered work? Is 5 pounds too much? 10 pounds? Maybe no pounds was the ideal situation. How much is too much? What can and what cannot be done on the Sabbath day? That's what they were trying to figure out. That's what in their legalistic mind they were trying to say, okay, we don't want to violate the law, so let's interpret the law so that we don't violate our interpretation of the law. Now apparently, thou shalt not carry thy mat on the Sabbath day was commandment number 4, Section B, subsection 2, paragraph 9. Okay? I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. But they had apparently determined that carrying your mat or your bed would be considered work. And so they see this man, and he's carrying his bed, his mat, on the Sabbath day, and they say, the law forbids you from doing that. And he says, but the guy who made me well, I'm the guy who was 38 years paralyzed over here, an invalid, 38 years. The guy who made me well told me to take my bed up and walk. They say, who is this guy? He doesn't know. Talk about that in a second. Well, the Jews, they have a problem with Jesus. No kidding, right? I mean, we've read through the Gospels. Seems like everything Jesus does ruffles their feathers. Well, Jesus, okay, remember the Sabbath the whole thing was put in place by God, okay? Jesus was God in the flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath day. Healing, even though he just spoke words, that would be considered work. He had worked on the Sabbath. More than that, he had told the guy to take up his bed and walk, which would make that man work on the Sabbath day. Never mind the 38 years of paralysis. Their tradition, which was man-made, their interpretation of the law, which was man-made, said you couldn't carry your mat. Never mind that the Son of God said he could. Okay? Don't know if you've ever thought of it that way or not, but Jesus had said he could. Jesus was God in the flesh. And it's sort of silly when we think about it. And we're almost, tempted to laugh a little bit at how silly this sounds to us about the Jews. And yet, sometimes we'll do exactly the same thing. Sometimes if somebody violates a tradition that we have, it makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes downright angry. If that song leader doesn't lead the right number of songs between the announcements and the opening prayer, that makes some people a little bit antsy. They're, oh, what are we doing? Aren't we going to have the opening prayer? Why did we say the opening prayer after one song instead of two songs? Why did we sing three songs before? Aren't we going to do the prayer? What's going on? And we're so focused on that we forget all about the fact that we're singing. And there are other examples that could be given as well. Traditions, though, are not the same thing as direct commands from God. Traditions are things that we come up with, that we make. Direct commands from God are the things that he tells us to do in his word. So, a lesson on love, a lesson on legalism, and finally there is a lesson on life. Notice what happens in verses 13 through 15. Jesus disappears. He disappears. He did a great thing and then didn't stand around to accept congratulations and shake hands and kiss babies. He does a good thing and then he blended in with the crowd. Some people have said, well, this is because it was still very early in his ministry and Jesus wanted to remain somewhat anonymous so that he could have some private time to himself with his disciples and everything. And that's a possibility. But I think there's another possibility as well. I think Jesus was one of those rare teachers who actually practiced what he preached. You say, what are you talking about? Well, if you look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, Jesus says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jesus is simply doing that which he told others to do. He wasn't doing it for the notoriety. He knew that, healing people was a great power that he had, but his primary purpose was teaching them. His primary purpose was to be with them. In fact, maybe Jesus knows that a little bit later on, actually in John chapter 6, verse 15, he's fed 5,000 men, plus women and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And he knows that if he doesn't dismiss the crowd, they're going to force him to become king. And so he does this good thing, this great thing. He heals this man, and then he just sort of blended in with the crowd. What about you? What about us? Do you do a good thing and wait for recognition? Wait for a pat on the back? Wait for somebody to come up and say, you know, that was really swell. I appreciate you. You know, in our house, we have 2 dogs. We're soon going to have a 3rd dog added to the mix. And but the 2 dogs that we have now, it's amazing how obedient they can be if you're holding a treat in your hand. They will do just about anything that you ask them to do. I mean, even if they don't have a clue what you ask them to do, they'll do stuff until they figure out what it is that you're saying. Or if you tell them to sit and they sit and you pat them on the head, they close their eyes and, oh, that feels so good. They do the good thing, but they do it for the reward. Folks, we're not to be like that. We do good things because it's pleasing to God. And in fact, in Matthew 5, verse 16, Jesus says, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Unfortunately for a lot of people, if they do something good and there's no recognition involved, or nobody else sees them, or they don't get a pat on the back, or congratulations, or something, they won't ever do anything good again. Jesus says, you know what? When people do pat you on the back, remember to point them to God. Remember that God is the reason why you did the good thing, so that they will praise not you, but praise your Father who is in heaven. Well, Jesus does this great thing and he disappears into the crowd, but then Jesus reappears. See, apparently a follow-up visit was necessary. Because see, this man that had been an invalid for 38 years apparently wasn't doing some of the things that he maybe should have been doing. Maybe 38 years ago he was doing something wrong and had an accident, and the invalid status was a consequence of that. And maybe now that he was no longer an invalid, he went right back and started doing the same things he had been doing. I don't know. But for whatever reason, Jesus finds the man in the temple and he warns him. Look at what he says in verse 14. See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. I ask you, what could possibly be worse than being an invalid for 38 years? Maybe being separated from God for all of eternity. I think that's a little bit worse than being an invalid for 38 years. You know, people will turn to God during bad times and then forget about God during good times. They're quick to blame God for all the bad, but slow to credit God for all the good. I guess that's just human nature, isn't it? When things are going good, we think it's all because of us. When things are going bad, we've got to find somebody else to blame. I imagine that this paralytic guy or invalid guy had done a lot of serious praying in those 38 years. Perhaps. I don't know, maybe he'd given up praying. I mean, maybe he prayed for the first 30 or so, but in the last 8, he hadn't prayed because God hadn't answered my prayer favorably, so, it's just not worth it anymore. People today are no different. Some people, the only time that they pray is at a funeral or a wedding or when they're in church. And that's the extent of their prayer life. And if that's all that you pray, then you're missing out on so much of what God has to offer. Or you think about football players. In the past, when they would score a touchdown, they'd drop to one knee, some of them would. But that same player, let's say it's a defensive person, and they intercept the ball and they run it back for a touchdown. They go to one knee and then they get up and start jumping around and celebrating with their teammates and everything. That same player, if they made an interception and they didn't score a touchdown, it was all about, look at me. Back of my shirt, look at the name. Yeah, I'm so great. If they score a touchdown, God is great. If they do something else that's good, they're great. It's all them. It's something to think about. Or someone with a serious illness. During the illness, they become very religious. When they're cured of that illness, they sort of aren't so much religious. I remember a man that have met in my ministry. And he had done some things in his life that had caused him to have some very serious health issues. On one occasion, those health issues landed him in the intensive care unit at the local hospital for a number of days. And then he was in a regular hospital room for a number of weeks afterwards. And I would go and I'd visit him. And we would talk about things. And he would tell me about how when he got over this, if God saw fit to heal him and get him back out of the hospital, how he was going to do so much good. And he was never going to miss church anymore, not even on Wednesday night. Okay, he was going to be there every service and everything. And he was going to make sure his family was there. And he was just going to be so much more dedicated to God than he had been in the past. And I talked with him about, and I prayed with him about that while he was in the hospital, and everything was going good. And he was discharged from the hospital. And for about 3 weeks, he never missed a service. But then something started coming up on Wednesday night, so he couldn't be there on Wednesday night. And then, well, he was still having some lingering pain from his condition. And so Sunday night became too much of a bother. And then it became too much trouble to come on Sunday morning most of the time. You know, if the weather wasn't just exactly right, you know, those bones, they can hurt a little bit and everything. And pretty soon he was back to doing the same stuff he was before he was in the hospital. It's human nature. From one encounter of Jesus, we get 3 lessons. A lesson on love. Go where you're needed the most. And don't just arbitrarily disqualify people from your love just because they don't look like you or act like you or dress like you or for whatever reason. A lesson on legalism. It has no place in the church that Jesus died for. And a lesson on life. Don't do good and start looking around for the notoriety and the recognition. And when you do get that recognition, be sure that you point people to God, because that's who you did it for. That's who we want to have glorified by everything that we do in our lives. I'm excited about this series of lessons. I'm excited because of the lessons that we will learn. But I'm also excited about this Sunday night series of lessons because of the challenges that Jesus is going to give to us. Because not all of his encounters are things that are happy, we might say. Some of them are very tough for us to digest. Perhaps even tougher to our 21st century ears than they were to his first century followers. But whenever he had an encounter, again, like I said earlier, there was a purpose behind it. And I believe that these encounters, there's a purpose behind them. Jesus has something to show us about how we interact with other people. How do you interact with other people? When other people see you, do they know that you're a Christian? Do they know that you love God and that you follow Christ? Or if they found out, would they say, no, there's no way. I've seen you outside. I've seen you doing other things. There's no way that you're a follower of Christ. You don't act anything like what I would imagine a Christian would act like. See, as I said this morning, your life is the first sermon that some people may ever hear. Things aren't right in your life. If you're not serving God with your life, then something needs to change. You need to start. And this evening, if we can help you through a public response to start serving God, then we want to do that. And we'll pray with you. We'll do whatever it takes to help you walk out these doors knowing that you are going to be recommitted to serving Christ with your life. If we can help you in a public way, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?